This is Dynasty Portfolio Weekly, hosted by Scott Connor.
Welcome back onto the trading floor, and today's Dynasty Portfolio Weekly topic is going to focus on when to pay for the bailout. So the bailout, the topic about when you lose a player to injury, and this got brought up earlier this week in our Discord, talking about losing somebody like Justin Herbert for the rest of the season, potentially Justin Jefferson for the rest of the season. Short-term injuries that are not supposed to impact a player's career. We're not talking about a torn Achilles or a rotator cuff injury or something like that where you're going, all right, this may change the value long-term a little bit. We're talking short-term. There's only 3 weeks left in the fantasy season. I've lost a player that I was counting on for the rest of the year, and I'm looking for the bailout. What do I pay? Do I explore the bailout? And if so, what do I pay? And it's not just applicable to here. It's a portfolio topic because it is a way in a portfolio to take advantage of these little weekly rifts in the market. In the new short-term dynasty game where assets go up and down and they fluctuate in terms of not just value, because I've talked about this before. It's not the value of the asset. You can look at keep, trade, cut. You can look at a trade calculator. You can look at the general valuation of an asset when something happens. It doesn't change a lot. What changes is the supply and demand, right? The people now willing to sell a guy like Justin Herbert, the supply is a lot higher. There's going to be more people at least considering a sale. The people that are willing to buy him, maybe very, very few at this point, unless they're in a position where it makes sense to buy him. And the buyers may be looking for a discount. So the idea of the bailout, it isn't just the end of the year. Obviously, if you can still make trades, you don't have a trade deadline in your league, then clearly you're looking at bailout options for the last 3 weeks of the season, especially if you're already in the playoffs. If you were relying on a guy like Herbert or Jefferson, that was one of your studs. If you could make a move to a equivalent asset and maybe pay a little bit of a tax or essentially pay for the bailout, right? You have to pay somebody else to bail you out. You're willing to do it. You're willing to explore those deals. But what about earlier in the season? What if this happens in week 4? What if this happens in week 6? Because I'll just say this, a viable strategy for me on teams where I lost Justin Herbert, especially because it's a quarterback. There's only so many. I've probably already roster constructed where maybe I have some other options. And if I do, am I willing just to ride it out with Bailey Zappi? I know that's kind of gross, but Jake Browning or Joe Flacco, Nick Mullins, another gross one. But if I have any of those guys, I'm probably sitting here going, okay, I have a starter that I can at least plug in next week. And this is easy discussion for people without a trade deadline, because if you're not considering the trade deadline aspect and you can trade all throughout the fantasy playoffs, then the teams that are able to rely on those Jake Brownings, Joe Flaccos for an individual week, if those go wrong, and the risk obviously is those guys go wrong, right? Now, if they go wrong, they don't perform, you're out of the playoffs, then it's over. But let's say it goes wrong and you are surviving another week, you still have the ability to trade in week 16 or week 17. So in those, you have to wrestle with the fact, do I pay the bailout cost? So I add a second to Justin Herbert to get Trevor Lawrence. I'd prefer Justin Herbert straight up. But if you wanted to say they were in the same tier, 1 for 1, okay. But the person selling you Lawrence is probably saying, all right, this is my time to maybe execute a little bit of leverage. I'm asking for a second, and it's not crazy. Do I want to pay that bailout? So for me, if this is earlier in the year, so we'll just dial it back. Let's say this type of injury happens week 6. Joe Burrow goes down. Week 3, Anthony Richardson goes down. I know those weren't the exact times, but let's say it happens that early in the year. At that point, the factors you have to consider is, what is the bailout cost? Like if I can move an asset that's injured for a season, a high-end asset like an elite quarterback, like an elite receiver, and all I have to add is a second, a pedestrian player that's worth the equivalent of a second, to hit the reroll button, that's where the portfolio players really shine. That is where having 50 leagues and having 5 shares of a bunch of these guys, you can say, all right, no big deal. I lose Burrow. I'm going to add to Burrow to go get Justin Herbert. I'm going to go give a third plus Burrow to get Kyler Murray. Wherever you draw the tiers, I'm just giving examples. I'm not even saying those are deals where I'm like, I absolutely have to do it. You make your own tiers. You decide what are the neutral pivots. But if it's earlier in the year, I'm much more likely to kind of stray from my portfolio of equal ownership of these guys in lieu of being able to pay for the bailout because I'm getting rest of season production, right? Now, on the contrary, if you're going to say I don't want to do that, you have to go in the other direction. And this is where a portfolio team can be beautiful. Because let's say you have a middle of the pack team that has one of these healthy quarterbacks. Let's say you have Kyler Murray and he's just coming back and the Burrow manager loses Burrow. What it can do is if you make that move in week 8, week 9, you now can push the direction of your team maybe closer to the bottom. Let's say you're not ready to win. You can trade for the injured guy, pick up a little leverage on top. Essentially, you're accepting the bailout payment from somebody else, but you have to do it in correlation with also being able to help your team go to the bottom. Why would I want to acquire Burrow on a team where I give up Justin Herbert when one healthy and one's not? Well, it's because there's some extrinsic value of me acquiring the injured player, right? Removing potential points, maybe helping my draft pick down the road. So that's where the portfolio strategy can really come into play, to where you can accept the bailout in situations where someone else needs it, and you have enough time to push your team to the bottom, meaning early enough in the season where I can actually dent my potential points. I can actually impact my draft pick. At this point, it's too late. Season's already over. Doesn't really matter. It's pure dynasty value at this point if you're making that deal. You're not getting any extrinsic value with a higher draft pick or anything like that by acquiring the injured player at this point. So earlier in the year, I'm actually willing to be more aggressive. And this is going to hit on this point over and over and over throughout this series. And you'll notice a lot of my strategies stem from this one major point: liquidity, draft pick equity. If you have those two things with the day-to-day dynasty game, you are much more likely able to pay for a bailout. You are much more likely to go to a team and say, you know what, I need to tier across this positional tier to get somebody that's healthy. And maybe you have to convince the other manager, hey, you're a middle of the pack team. You should consider trading your Trevor Lawrence for Joe Burrow. And I'll give you the IR guy, but I need to pay you enough of a bailout to convince you to do it. And that's what a lot of times has to take place for those kind of deals to get done. You only get that done if you have extra stuff to give them. If you have extra picks, you have a couple thirds laying around, you have a second laying around. It's no different than if it's a smaller deal and you need to buy a backup quarterback, you need to buy a backup running back, you need to buy anything that can fill in temporarily. What is the key? The key is at all points having extra stuff. And even if that is stuff where you don't think right now that those 225 fourths mean anything, until you never know when a fourth and a player can turn into a third. You never know what it can turn into later, but I know that having liquidity and flexibility when it comes to draft picks can really only help me bail myself out in circumstances when I need it. And I don't necessarily want to use the reverse bailout to acquire those picks, meaning I'm not in a rush to trade my healthy quarterback for someone's Justin Herbert unless the bailout payment to me is actually worth it to me, because there's no extrinsic value, right? I can't tank my team any further to the bottom by making that deal. So I'm looking at it like I'm just helping out that other manager without really getting anything in return other than what they're willing to add. And like I talked about, if they're not willing to add something significant enough, they're probably better off just saying, you know what, Herbert's a lost cause for the rest of the year. Justin Jefferson's a lost cause for the rest of the year. Instead of trying to trade those guys 80 cents on the dollar or having to add something significant to quote unquote bail myself out, I'll just buy a cheap replacement 2 to 3 week option and let the chips fall where it may. And that's kind of where I'm at when it's later in the season. I talked about the example when it's earlier in the year, right? If you can get 8 weeks worth of production, it's probably worth it to go for the bailout payment, where you pay somebody a second, you pay somebody another starter to get the deal done. That's probably on the high end. I don't want to start giving away first plus. Like, those are the deals where I'm always willing to go the other way. But when I have extra liquidity and draft picks laying around, sure, I'll give you a second to fix a mistake or to fix an injury that was just bad variance on my side. But when it's later on in the year, I don't really want to move my elite assets to go right across the tier. I don't even want to go buy CD Lamb for Justin Jefferson. I'm more interested in just saying, you know what, can I go buy another piece that can produce for me in the same range? But all of this is taking a portfolio approach and looking at it from both sides, looking at it from an ownership perspective. This is one thing that I really try to track, especially, and I brought up the elite quarterbacks because that is one of the ranges where, of course, I want to get as many of these elite quarterbacks as I can. I'd love to have as many as I can get, but conceivably, you can only have so many across your leagues. But I like to stay pretty fluid with the ownership of those quarterbacks, but I always want to get it back to an equilibrium point, meaning I never really long-term want to be way too overweight on someone like Jalen Hurts or Lamar Jackson or even Burrow or Herbert or Lawrence. Like I kind of want to stay in a range where it's 10 to 20% of those guys. And other people will argue, man, I want as much Patrick Mahomes as I can get. Well, sure. But not once you already have a portfolio of teams built. There's only so much I can get. Now, when it comes to like startup strategy and stuff, I'll talk more about that in the offseason on how I approach that. Once I have some leagues this year that I'm going to shed, I'm going to sell the teams. I have some other leagues where I may give away. And then I have leagues that I'm going to add, do some dispersals. So the portfolio is going to shift a little bit, but it's a totally different strategy if you're starting fresh and you say, I already have 20% share of Lamar Jackson. Maybe not somebody that I would target in a lot of startups unless I can move some pieces around. But for right now, end of the season, I am more likely to basically only pay for the bailout if it is very close within the tiers, meaning I would rather just live with whatever the replacement player is going to be, especially at quarterback. I'd rather go buy a third round Joe Flacco, third round Jake Browning, Nick Mullins, Bailey Zappi. Now, is it going to truly get me home? Probably not. But again, part of the portfolio is I'm not as worried about one league. I don't have to look at one league and say, man, I really, really have to win this league or it's not really going to work out. So I think that's something you can also leverage is once you have enough leagues, kind of just let the variance take over, especially if I can look at the upcoming matchups in week 15 and say, you know what, Joe Flacco, Jake Browning, those guys actually have pretty good matchups. Not that they're going to finish better than every elite quarterback out there, but is that the best bang for your buck given the cost? So I think it's interesting when you look at some of these bailout deals, what people will post. There will be people that are giving up high-end capital just for short-term bailouts. And generally, if you're playing in a portfolio, those are the type of managers you can take advantage of. That is the type of behavior that you can take advantage of when people are basically saying, I'll pay anything. I have a problem. I'm doubling down on my problem to fix it. And they end up going into even more debt in the form of future picks or injured players where they know in 3 months the injured player they're trading away is going to be worth well more than what they got back. So I think as a portfolio player, that is one place you can leverage everybody else is generally accept bailout deals when they come your way, especially if you're comfortable with your rostership of those players already. So it's a good theme. Not a super long episode, but just something that came up with the injuries this weekend heading into the playoffs, especially if you have no trade deadline. Guys like Herbert, guys like Jefferson, they may miss the rest of the year, but they're obviously short-term injuries that are not going to be a big deal long-term. So how do you navigate that? Do I move them for the value? Or do I go for the cheapest option and just stash those guys on the IR and let the chips fall where they may? What you don't want to do, and it's not a novel concept here, is what you don't want to do 100% is a bailout deal that includes a bunch of pieces. You don't want to say, well, I lost Herbert, so I'm going to go buy Jared Goff and Chris Olave. And that's what I'm getting back. A deal like that where you go, okay, I'm getting 2 or 3 pieces. In the short term, it looks great because all of those guys are healthy. They should produce better than the replacement value that I can find on waivers or what I can find in a cheap trade. But likely you're going to regret that deal. You're definitely going to regret that deal in a couple months where you're like, man, can I tear up from Jared Goff? And the answer is no. The answer is the time to do it would have been if you were in this circumstance where you had those guys and were able to maybe tier up to a quarterback that was injured. So generally, you can play in both sides of the coin. That's how portfolio playing works. But understanding the risks of where it would make sense on both sides, but also the timing of it is crucial. You always have to consider, if I'm bailing somebody out, what else am I getting on top of it? Not just what draft pick am I getting on top. What else is the direction of my team benefiting from by making that deal? And then if I'm getting bailed out, how cheap can I get bailed out? Can I get bailed out by just throwing around an extra second, an extra couple thirds? Sure, because I probably acquired those with what? Liquidating pieces, liquidating a running back for a third, liquidating a couple rookie roster clogger receivers for thirds, whatever it might be. That's the crucial part of playing in a portfolio, is liquidating as much as possible so that really in any one of my leagues where I need to make a move this week, I can go to them and say, oh, cool, I have a couple extra seconds and a couple extra thirds. I can just throw those around. They're like money where it doesn't really matter. I can just throw it around. Cool. If I need to use it, fine. If not, I'll find a time later. But that's the reason I got it in the first place, was to be able to throw it around. So I hope everybody enjoys this episode in this series thus far. We're a month in. It's been pretty successful. A lot of great comments, a lot of feedback on the channel with it. So I'll keep it going. Let me know if you have any topics you want me to discuss. Again, a lot of the topics from here come from our Discord discussions, follow-up questions I get from podcasts or from live streams. And they just organically develop. Things go through my mind, and I say, you know what, that would be a good quick hit topic for one of these episodes. So check out everything over at destinationdevy.com. Sign up for the Destination 5 tier if you're interested in getting access to all the bonus content along with the Discord. Like the streams, like the channel here on YouTube, like the podcast feed, Destination Devy Radio, and Wake Up with Ray G. And then, of course, everything on Dynasty Trades in 5. So good luck in Week 15, first week of the playoffs. Hopefully you do not have a matchup and you have a bye. But if you are playing, best of luck getting to the semifinals. And I will sign off for the week. Be chill.